Welcome to this video, where we'll take a look at the new Create Your Own Complex Oscillator System, or COCO system by Afterlater Audio. This is a multi-module complex oscillator system consisting of a series of 1 to 3 oscillators connected to a central control module. All the modules intermingle and interconnect behind the scenes, giving you easy complex oscillator waveforms and modulation with little to no external patching. One oscillator offers you more complex waveforms with more functionality, while the other oscillator provides as a great low HP modulation source. And one control module provides upper harmonics via wavefolding, while the other control module provides lower subharmonics via attenuated clock divisions. In this video, we'll take a look at how to connect the system together and look at every knob, switch, input, output, and function of each of the 4 new modules in the COCO series. In the series, we have the oscillators Cascades and Brooks, and the control modules Canyon and Valley. And let's get started. All right, let's take a quick look at how to install the COCO system. That's pretty easy, and it all connects to our control module, Valley or Canyon. Now let's look at the back of Canyon here. You can see we have our power pin connectors, oscillator 3, oscillator 2, and oscillator 1, and the red stripes are clearly marked. So that's pretty easy to connect. Now what does it look like on the back of the oscillators? So here we have the back of a connected COCO system. We have all 4 things, power, oscillators 1, 2, 3, and 4, connected to the back of Valley here. And you could see in all the other modules, we don't need to worry about power. So you could see that here, this power is wide open, and there's a separate plug for expander, and that is on both Brooks and Cascade. So we plug them all up together, make sure they're all nice and tight, and we're ready to go. And now I want to do like a really quick 1-minute rundown of how the COCO system works. For a full system, we have 3 oscillators connected to the back of the control module. Each oscillator is interconnected with each other via any of these inputs with the arrow, meaning these arrows here are the modulation wave or the sine wave coming from oscillator 2, and this arrow on oscillator 2 is coming from oscillator 1, the arrow on oscillator 3 is coming from oscillator 2, and it's all the modulation wave which is set on the back jumper of Cascades, or it's just the sine wave if it's Brooks. Cascades, you could use the sine wave or the morph wave, and all these modules are also interconnected via the control module here. We have track and sync. Sync gives us hard sync to the oscillators. Right now, they're both set to off, but 1 can sync with 2, or it could sync to 2 and 3. So all the oscillators are synced from oscillator 1. And we could do the same thing with tracking, otherwise known as our volt per octave and our pitch. So we could send our tracking over to 2 if we have volt per octave and we want to play something in unison or play a chord. We can pitch track 1 to 2 or 1 to 2 and 3, all from just 1 input on this volt per octave. And then we have our central control module, which on Valley is a Wavefolder, and on Canyon it is a Subharmonics generator. But basically we get nice modulation sources within our oscillator here to make it a full complex oscillator. And look at all these inputs and outputs we have to work with. All right, now let's jump into oscillators. First of which, Cascades. Now I'm going to talk about Cascades as it applies to oscillator 1 in the COCO system. But note, you could also use Cascades as oscillators 2 and or oscillator 3. The internal routings just change a little bit. First I'll do a quick rundown of the module, and then we'll dive deeper into all the cool waveforms we could get out of the thing. Cascades is a 10 HP oscillator with quantized coarse tune knob, which is great for performative expression. Then we have a fine tune knob that goes down and up a full octave, or 1 volt. We have a VCO LFO switch. We have an FM input with attenuator here for exponential or linear Right now it's internally routed from oscillator 2. There's linear and exponential. We have pulse width modulation control with this knob here and this input here. There's no internal routing for pulse width, so we could use whatever we want. The pulse width does not affect the sub, but it does affect the morph. But we'll get to that in just a second. Now, before I go through the rest of these knobs and switch here, I'll go through these outputs real quick. We have our pulse, of course, sawtooth wave, morph wave, sine wave, cosine wave. Now the cosine wave is phased 90 degrees, which gives us a cool stereo effect, or we can get quadrature using sum and invert. We then have our sub wave, which is an octave lower than our current pitch. Triangle wave. Then we have two waveform inputs, our modulator wave and our carrier wave for the amplitude modulation. And now we can get into these knobs and switches here. The AM applies to the AM knob here, and this is just the amount that the modifier affects the carrier. And right now it's oscillator 2 modulating oscillator 1, and it's a sine wave modulating a sine wave. Now we could input different waveforms here to give us different audio rate modulation. And note here, our amplitude modulation can do two things. Right now it is switched to doing a full wave rectification of our modulator wave. So it is inverting the negative portion of the sine wave to be positive so that it doesn't affect our carrier to be amplitude below 0 for half the time. Or we could increase the modulator wave 5 volts, shifting everything up, giving us a different waveform. And different modulation sounds. We'll dive deeper into more sources and carriers later on. Now this brings us to our morph, which is really cool. We have a triangle wave, which morphs to a saw wave. Now notice how this morphs to our pulse wave. It kind of splits it down the middle and shifts it up and down. It doesn't linearly warp smoothly between these how you would expect. But it gives us nice step patterns, which would be great for CV in LFO mode. But another great feature of the morph here is we have internal routing to this attenuator here from oscillator 2. Now another cool thing about the morph control is we do have pulse width modulation. So if I switch to LFO mode for oscillator 2, we can more smoothly warp between the waveforms here using the internally routed sine wave into the morph input here. Works better at half amplitude. We then have full per octave input and a hard sync. And we'll get into how the track and sync work with Valley or Cascades when I'm talking about Brooks next. So that in a nutshell is Cascades, but let's dive deeper into all the cool sounds we could get with that modulation from Oscillator 2. First, I'll show some noteworthy patch ideas and patch tips, and then we'll dive deeper into just some sound exploration without me talking. First one, stereo with sine and cosine. So we could actually just use those two as our two outputs. And it gives us a little bit of a stereo effect because of that phasing. So what we want to do is actually use sum and invert, which I'm just bringing up now because it works so well with Cascades. So what we're going to do is plug our sine into A and cosine into B. And to fully appreciate the stereo, we'll just listen to the sum of A and B. And now in stereo. So you can see it's a much richer sound that even starts to make my voice sound cool because of the invert phasing. So when you mix this in with frequency modulation, you get all sorts of cool stuff. And that's a cool stereo effect. Now with the morph output, we could actually get a cool wave-folded sound just with the input internally routed from Oscillator 2. Now you can see we're getting some upper harmonics here, but what works best is when we sync it. And the higher we go on the pitch, the more wave folding we get. When morph is synced to Oscillator 2. And there's a cool wave-folded sound. Now let's dig deeper into the AM output here, where I'll start by using, say, the square wave from Oscillator 2 as the modulator instead of the sine wave, which is internally routed. Get some nice bell-like harmonics going. Or what if we made the morph wave our carrier? We got a nice wobbly morph wave. And note with the track, the octave placement here, the tuning, and the frequency modulation all get routed to Oscillator 2 or Oscillator 2 and 3 with this track. That's why Oscillator 2 still goes down by an octave when we change Cascades. And we have this AM mod that we can't forget about, which offsets our mod wave, which would probably work better with our square wave. The +5 volts with the square wave obviously works better than the half wave rectification. It's just giving us a high gate. So if we do the saw, and now I'm just going to play around with things. Now let's take a look at Brooks, the 4 HP companion oscillator for the COCO system. Brooks works best as oscillators 2 or 3, and I'm going to be talking about it as oscillator 2, but I'll also kind of give the rundown on it as oscillator 3. Brooks is a 4 HP, also through 0 oscillator with the same pitch range as Cascades. It just accesses that pitch range a little bit differently. We have a fine-tune knob up top here that goes plus and minus 2 octaves. And then we have this octave switch here, which right now it's at 3. We go down to 0, 1 or 2, and then here's 3, 4, 5, and then we get 6, 7, and 8. So we get that whole range there. We then have the VCO LFO switch, of course, and the frequency modulation knob, which is internally routed here from the mod wave, which is the sine wave right now, coming from Cascades, oscillator 1. We then have volt per octave tracking. We have a hard sync, which is internally routed from oscillator 1 via the sync on Valley or Canyon. We set that to 1 syncing to 2 or syncing to 2 and 3. And that is the sync. And we have this interesting input, the reverse input, which reverses our waveform with a high gate. And it doesn't sound anything special here, but when we get at faster rates, we get much cooler effects. If you go too high, you kind of kill the sound, but you can get some cool effects still, especially frequency modulating back on that, because the frequency modulation on 3 is actually routed from 2. And the waveforms we get out of this bass are square, a sine, our saw, and a triangle, which aren't that exciting on their own, but we saw we get those real interesting waveforms from all the cross modulation, especially from Cascades. And that is Brooks. And now let's get to the fun stuff. Now let's take a look at the first of the 2 control modules in the series, Valley, which creates upper harmonics, i.e. wave folding, and has a crossfade mixer for oscillators 1 and 2 or whatever you choose. So first off, we have 2 outputs. We have output and fun, which is our fundamentals output, which is just a crossfade mix of oscillators 1 and 2, which are internally routed to Valley. And we don't have a pitch going on here, and I could actually control that with tracking, where I send the volt per octave tracking from Cascade to Brooks. And note, it is the sine wave or the mod wave as set on the back of Cascades. In Brooks, it's always going to be a sine wave, or what are routed to in1 and in2, because if you're using this as a wavefolder, you want that most basic waveform, which is where we have the output, and I could show you the way the signal flows. So we have this crossfade mix between 1 and 2. And then that runs into the second crossfade, which is just the fun output or our wavefolder. So I could go full wavefolder here with no dry signal. And we can see order is our wavefold amount. And odd even is kind of our symmetry control with other wavefolders, or your phase, whatever you'd want to call it with that. So ideally, if you wanted a third waveform into here, you could throw that into your odd even input here with your attenuator all the way up and get a 3-channel mix of this wavefolder input. And it's worth noting that the order has this attenuator here, which actually routes from oscillator 3, which makes sense because we have a mix of 1 and 2, and you don't want to modulate with the same audio waveform you're using, so that's why it pulls from 3. And then we also have CV input for our crossfader here, 1 and 2, and we have our fun fold crossfade input. So you can play with both of those for interesting effects. We could, of course, use different waves into inputs 1 and 2. Let's also take a quick look, real quick, as to how much wavefolding we can do. So you can see how this adjusts kind of our pulse width, more or less. So here's our base wave. And it maxes out there. But we could probably push it further. We cannot. So it does have a clipping limit here, which is nice. It gives us a nice clean wavefolder with a nice cool wavefolding effect. And that is Valley. Okay, now that we got Canyon all hooked up into the COCO system, let's take a closer look at the module. Canyon is a 10 HP Subharmonics generator to complement the upper harmonic generator that is Valley, i.e. wavefolder, and Canyon takes subharmonics and divides them into these divisor of eighths, where we could take a pitch and add in these subharmonics. What's really cool is we could dial in each one individually. We could take the odd side out and the even side out. We can crossfade between the two for interesting effects. We have a nice mix level control here for the mix output, which is extra great for CV. And the internal signal is determined by the clock switches here. By default, with these switches set to the top position, it is oscillator 1, or we could switch to oscillator 2, and we can do that separately for the odd and the even side. And it says 1/3 here because there's a jumper on the back of the module that allows us to change whether the top switch clock comes from oscillator 1 or oscillator 3, but it does apply to both at the same time. And we then have the clock reset switch with button here that gives us a nice reset for our pitch, especially if we're doing something more with stepped CV, as you can see with this module. Be great for doing some cool sequencing or something like that, which I'll show in a little bit. But it's a great little subharmonic chord generator. You can get some really deep subs in here. I mean, that's pretty deep from our original 1/8. Then add a 1/6 or the 4th in there for a little extra depth. Now what I noticed is if you have the earlier ones up too high, they'll kind of cancel out the later ones. So you want to kind of keep that in mind when playing around. Why am I not hearing anything different going on? It's because you probably have the 1, 2 knobs too high up, or you have 7 or 8 too high up. It's also worth noting that the mix output is unipolar for extra goodness with CV. And another cool effect that we'll notice here is, you notice we have this nice stepped pattern here. With a jumper on the back, we could actually set the mod source that goes into oscillator 1 to be the crossfade or CF output of Canyon. So it'll send this crossfade mix to our morph input, our mod input here, and our frequency modulation input. It's also worth noting on Canyon, there's a mistake on the track and sync switches where each of them individually are upside down. So 1 to 2 is down switch, and the up switch is 1 to 2 and 3. Now let's take a listen to what we could do with this that's a bit more musical. So with this patch, I have Canyon patched up as my sequencer running into a quantizer, which is then running into Carve to give it some randomized slew. And then I have the volt per octave going from Carve being slewed there into the volt per octave of 1 here. So for the clock on Canyon, I have a molted clock just coming from PAMS, and it's coming at ×2 speed. And I have it just going into the odd side and the even side. I have the even out triggering my envelope generator. And I have a triangle wave shifting us between the odd side and the even side. And as I play with these attenuators, I'll get a different sequence. We get those quick note changes with it on 1, obviously. And we get more rhythmic stuff on the odd side. But we get those nice bass hits on the even side. And this is just the AM output of Cascades. And I have oscillator 2 being frequency modulated by oscillator 1, and I'm about to do that for oscillator 1. And that's Canyon as a sequencer and some cool sounds too. And now we'll take a look at using Canyon as an audio effect and just exploring the knobs here for a little bit and see what kind of harmonic goodness we can hear here. And let's add some Volt Proactive to that. And that's it. That's the COCO series, the Create Your Own Complex Oscillator system, featuring Cascades and Brooks as the oscillators, and Canyon or Valley as our center control module that ties the whole thing together. Next is a little piece of music I put together utilizing the COCO system as the oscillator source for everything in this aside from the drums.